Right, well, my name is Gareth Ceidiog Hughes. I'm Welsh, I'm autistic, a writer who currently works in communication. I'm a writer who writes a bit about autism and list by trainings. And I'm the former editor of the Welsh news site Nation.Cymru.
So, do you want to tell me a bit more about yourself, your own experience as being autistic, and how you have written about it?
Autism has impacted my whole life in a number of profound ways. But for much of my life, I was completely unaware I was autistic. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s, in my mid 30s, that I got a diagnosis. And at that time, I was struggling a great deal. I was very anxious, had chronic anxiety, depression, and was suffering from a chronic pain condition that now I'm pretty sure was fueled by this anxiety. And it was during that period, in that period of recovery, that I found out that I was autistic, and all of a sudden, a lot of things about my life started to make a lot more sense. Why I struggled in the way that I had, but also why I was also good at certain things. A lot of the narrative about autism likes to frame the condition as something uniformly negative. Autistic traits generally characterized as negative traits. And that's a narrative that I'm hoping to challenge through my writing and hopefully through podcasts such as this.
And from when, as you said, you were diagnosed in your late 30s, exposed by how late it was for yourself. So, can you tell me about what are the things that you noticed that you think could have been autistic when you got diagnosed? What were the things you able to look back through your life and see, wait, that was me being autistic?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things, and it's autism. It's a wide spectrum, and it's agglomeration of different characteristics that often impact in varying degrees depending on context. It's very complex, and it's not always easy to pinpoint these things. But one thing that I did realize in my teenage years were really quite lonely years. When I was in primary school, I was actually quite popular. I was good at sports and all this kind of stuff. And in my teenage years, I began to a lot more detached from my peers, and they were communicating on a frequency that I didn't really understand, wasn't really able to tune into, and I got socially to a large degree, really, and that was really quite painful, difficult. And in my 20s, I started teaching myself about human interaction. I started teaching myself about body language, about social dynamics, socializing, how to make friends and influence people, books on psychology, heuristics, all kinds of different things, and watched a lot of videos online. And during this period, I was able to skill socially and was far better able to communicate according to neurotypical norms, if you like. And my social life did improve a great deal as a result. And that was extraordinarily validating. It wasn't ultimately fulfilling, because what I'd learned to do basically was to mask. I'd learned how to conceal my autistic traits. And even when I was part of the group, so to speak, I never really felt of the group. And I still felt like an outsider, like a bit of an alien, really, even though I was more on the inside. And when I got my diagnosis, what the psychiatrist told me was that I'd figured out that I was autistic, but I didn't have a label for it. And what the psychiatrist was able to do was give me that label. And that's when a lot of things about my past and a lot of things about my struggle at that period and off into the future began to make more sense. And I think a lot of autistic people have this experience when they get diagnosis, they go through a period of revision, and you look at things through a radically different lens. And these can be small things. For example, I'm very noise sensitive, and people crunching crisps, for example, can drive me up the wall. My father found it quite hard to understand why I was so sensitive to this tiny amount of noise. And now it makes sense because it's an autistic sensory thing. So there's a lot of different things. And the fact that social battery can drain quite quickly, even especially if it involves a lot of masking. So I need recovery time. It's not that I don't enjoy socializing, I do, but I need to be careful with regards to how much I do it, and the way in which I do it, and the less masking that I'm getting better being more autistic, not less autistic, because very often the prescription for autistic people is autistic traits are bad, and what you need to do is train the autistic person out of the autistic traits, and then they'll be hunky-dory, all will be good. Don't ascribe to belief. There are positives to autism, there are negatives, just like there are positives to being neurotypical and negatives to. So what I want to do is try and mitigate against the difficulties and to lean into the positives. So it's trying to be more autistic. Autism gives me an intense focus, and I notice details, and I notice patterns. You can find certain sensory environments quite challenging. So what I need to do is limit the amount of time that I spend in them, and if I do spend time in them, find certain ways to mitigate, trying to harness my autism in the most effective way. It's a process, and I'm still learning.
As you said, thing is, since you were diagnosed in your mid-30s, since you lived your whole life, as I said, you still lived it, kind of sensing your differences and working with that, but you spent like most of your life, for say like 35 years, of thinking you were different, but you didn't know you were autistic. And so that is, as you said, it can make it harder to make the process to unmasking, and it's something that does definitely take many of years to work on, and to be able to feel a bit more comfortable of finding your autistic self, especially when you sometimes with unmasking out, there's the complex thing of what does yourself look like when you're not masking. And I think that's probably something that through your burnout and through your recovery from that, and through your own discovery post-diagnosis, that is probably something that you have to reckon with.
Yeah, sometimes it's not always easy to discern when one is masking and when one isn't. It's both calculating, but it also becomes intuitive in a way, and it becomes a reflex. And masking is a kind of it's a defense mechanism, really. It's a kind of social camouflage, because a lot of autistic people, we spend much of our lives getting all this negative feedback for autistic traits, and we can internalize a lot of this negativity. I certainly did, and so you associate a lot of your autistic characteristics with negativity, and it's a process to unlearn this negativity that you've absorbed over your lifetime up until the point of diagnosis. And yeah, it's difficult, and it's challenging, and it's complex, and it's not always very easy to unravel. And so some of the sort of social niceties that you learn that maybe you weren't aware of, they're useful things to have and useful things to use, to implement. And masking, it does benefits. One, it's a way to avoid negative feedback, to avoid discrimination. And there is a danger to unmasking because autistic people mask for a reason. It's to avoid being discriminated against. So there's understandably a concern about unmasking. And what I try and do is be careful with who I choose to unmask around. So I know that I'm safe to unmask around close friends, my wife, family, and so on and so forth. I'd be very wary of suggesting to any autistic person, yeah, just unmask and that's the way forward. In an ideal world, yes, you would be able to do that, but there's a reason autistic people mask is to avoid discrimination, and that discrimination unfortunately does exist. It is out there, and I feel that I have to act with a kind of autistic realpolitik in a way, that the world is as it is and I have to contend with that. But that doesn't mean in the process that I can't advocate for change, fight for change, and try and alter the narrative that seems very skewed and really quite damaging to autistic people. And I think that damage is seen in a number of ways. You see it in the way autistic people are discriminated against in the job market. It's only 30% of autistic people in the UK in work, and even fewer when you look at full-time work and you look at the mental health stats for autistic people, you look at the suicide rate and life expectancy, and it's a horrific state of affairs. So there is a lot of work to do in order to shift the narrative, because until that narrative shifts, society won't shift in its attitudes and won't do the material things that need to be done to improve the lives of autistic people, which means hiring people for jobs in a far more rational and effective way. And the specific things that you would do in a hiring process to ensure that's the case, ensuring that teachers in school know what autism actually is, not this skewed narrative idea of what autism is, but what it actually is, so they know how to look out for it in the classroom and how to support autistic kids, the neurodiverse kids, and get the most out of them in the classroom. Because the great tragedy of all this is that there are an awful lot of autistic people, neurodiverse people who have a lot to offer, have a lot of ability. And it's awful that they are stopped from contributing in the way that they could because society discriminates in the way that it does. And it's extraordinarily unfair to autistic people, but it also doesn't work for society either, because they miss out on all this talent, all this ability, all this ability to spot patterns and internalizing and interpreting data. And there's a moral aspect to it as well. Autistic people are often incredibly diligent and honest. And one particular bugbear of mine is sort of autisticness is viewed as something uniformly negative, whereas actually, when channeled in a positive way, it can be fantastic. I've seen one, I remember reading something somewhere, a psychologist believed that Einstein was autistic, and he spent a lot of time obsessing about physics, and out of that came the theory of relativity and all this kind of stuff. And one thing that makes me very angry is this idea that we need to cure autism and we need to cure autistic people. And I'm thinking, what would you cure Einstein of coming up with a theory of relativity? Are you insane? Have you lost your mind? It's nuts to me, and it's completely irrational. There are autistic success stories out there, but they are the exception and not the rule, because of the way society and societal structures basically discriminate against autistic people and act as barriers instead of something that enables. Yeah, the narrative certainly does need to change.
Yeah, seems like something you're really passionate about.
Yeah, passionate, angry, I write a lot about autism, and I'm really short of things to write about, I should say, because there's just so much that makes me angry and annoyed. Passionate is one way of putting it, and yeah, yes, I am certainly passionate, but I'm also very angry and very annoyed, and that acts as a fuel for my writing.
Yeah, and it seems that one thing I want to go back on is when you said about how you, in terms of when he was younger, in your late teen years, when you started watching videos of and hyper focusing on social behaviour and behaviour of non-autistic people to understand other people's social rules. And I guess it's something that has helped you in terms of informing what you write and how you perceive autism, as it seems masking and the social ideas around that and the social rules in society is something that you're very keenly interested, and it does seem to be informing your journalism and also informing how you understand yourself and look at how you mask without that masking. Sometimes got to something that could make things a bit more difficult to yourself just to learn something.
Yeah, I feel that my autism has been extraordinarily useful. I may have been quite slow in getting to understand non-autistic people, neurotypical people, but I've actually been able to use my autistic obsessiveness, my autistic attention to detail, and my autistic ability to spot patterns far better understand non-autistic people than I did. And there are patterns to their behavior. There is a certain underlying logic to it as well. It has a kind of internal logic, if you like. It's not always rational, and very often it is decidedly irrational. So it is something that's certainly possible for autistic people to understand. I believe that autistic people can harness their inherent ability for learning, pattern recognition, spotting details. These can be harnessed to understand neurotypical people. And I do think it's important to do that. I do think we need to understand our peers in that way. One,
Yeah.
just it's interesting. Two, it's a matter of kind of survival and getting by in this world and avoiding discrimination and trying to strive and move forward and make a contribution. It's a useful tool in that way, but that doesn't mean we need to be like them or try to
Yeah.
be like them.
Then pop this question to you is how do you feel, as you said, it is important to understand the behaviours of neurotypical non-autistic people for autistic people, but it's mostly autistic people that make the effort to
Yeah.
understand autistic people. But how do you feel that the kind of and the understanding is not often reflected from non-autistic people trying to empathise and understand with us autistic people?
Yeah, it is a frustration that it's largely autistic people who are having to make the effort to understand our non-autistic peers, and very little effort comes in the other direction. And that is a source of frustration, and it is skewed. And but at the moment, it's unavoidable. And if we are going to change the narrative, we need to appeal to a majority of people. We need to speak to them in a way that they understand so they get it and they alter their behavior. And that's not an easy thing to do. It's hard. The fact of the matter is, non autistic people, most of them aren't going to make an effort off their own bat. Some will, but the majority won't. So if we do want to change things, it may be unfair that we have to make the effort, but it is what it is. So we have to learn how non autistic people think in order to appeal to them, to get them to
Yeah.
change the way they think, and to persuade them to change
Yeah,
the
and
way they think. And it's difficult because I think it's quite hard for them to conceptualize
yeah,
what life is like for an autistic people. It's so outside of their that they just can't quite comprehend it.
yeah,
And how do we take our experience, which is very different, and relate it to something in their own experience? So we need to find a way to bridge that. And
yeah.
it is a
Can
challenge,
I
and it's
just
still something I'm trying to figure out.
that's important for us to educate others, but I know you're able to communicate verbally and late diagnosed and been a man yourself. And for me, what of all the diversity of the neurodivergent community in terms of presenting who's talking about autism and who's writing about it, who's speaking about it, do you think it's actually being reflected, the diversity of the autistic community? And do you think there is a male perspective who are lower support needs, who are more able to verbally communicate?
Yeah, certainly. This is something that I've been thinking about, because as far as autism is concerned, I've had a lot of struggles and a lot of difficulties, and I've been through quite a traumatic time as well. But I'm still one of the lucky ones because I'm able to find employment. That doesn't mean I've never had challenges in the workplace, because I have, and I witnessed and been on the receiving end of anti-autistic discrimination, and it's not a very nice thing. But nevertheless, I am able to find employments, and I am able to succeed in work under the right conditions. And so I am one of the lucky ones, and I have learned to mask, and I have managed to gain an ostensible kind of acceptance among kind of non-autistics, if you like. And that isn't the case for a lot of autistic people. And it's very easy to just see things through the prism of your own experience. And my experience is I'm one of the lucky ones who is able to find employment, who is able to get along, who has relatively low support needs, who is married and has a supportive family behind me, and who has friends. And it's not the same for every autistic. But I think those of us who are in a more fortunate position, that it's incumbent on us to advocate on behalf of people who aren't in such a fortunate position as well. That is something that I do want to do. But I am aware that what I write about, I write from my own experience, because that's what I know. And there is a certain inevitability to that, because that's the experience that I have. But it doesn't mean that I'm not cognizant that it's a wide spectrum. It's not just wide, it's
Yeah,
deep, and it's
yeah.
extraordinarily.
When you was talking about your own personal experience in your career, tell me a bit about how did you become a journalist?
Yeah, this is another area in which I was fortunate, because my father is a journalist. He is a former reporter for HTV Wales, and he's also a former newspaper editor. And it was him who saw some of my writing, and he said, I really think you can write. And my father had his own public relations firm, and he still has it. But what he suggested was that I train up as a journalist and then go and work for him. So I was able to get a start working for my father. My father is someone who's very good at what he does. He has very high standards, very exacting standards. He wants things done well. He wants things done correctly. He wants things done to a high standard. So I learned a great deal from him, and was able to build my skill set under his tutelage. So it wasn't a typical employment relationship, and that came with certain challenges, but it also shielded me from certain things as well. My father wasn't going to discriminate against me in the workplace. I was very fortunate then, and most autistic people don't have that. So I had a very lucky start. And then I started writing a bit for Nation.Cymru. I was sending them news tips and writing columns for them. And one day, one of the founders, who was one of the directors at the time, got in touch and asked me whether I'd be interested in becoming the editor. And so I did. And I really enjoyed that job. And we built up the audience a great deal. It was around about 500,000 readers or hits a month at the time that I joined. And within a few months, it doubled to over 1 million hits a month. And we also increased the subscriber base a great deal as well. That almost doubled, and I really enjoyed the job. And I don't like to think I was good at it. And I got that job during the pandemic. So I was working from home, I was working online, was obsessive about it and was burnt out by the time that I left. But I was quite fortunate because I was editor, I had a great deal of autonomy. It doesn't mean that I could do absolutely everything that I wanted to. I had quite a bit of latitude and quite a bit of autonomy in that role, which suited me a great deal. So I was lucky in many respects in that role. And where I find it difficult is where the standards that I set and the way that I need to work, when those imperatives are not understood in the workplace, and that can be quite challenging. And I have been in I don't want to go into too much detail about this, at least not at the moment, but I have been in a work situation where the way that I know that I need to work in order to get results wasn't understood, and neither were the standards that I needed to maintain. And it can be quite difficult sometimes when you go into somewhere where the standards are lower than the ones that you have, and they don't understand why things need to be maintained. In that situation, it's usually better to move on and to find an environment that's hospitable and where people just have more sense.
Can you explain what you mean in terms of standards? What are the specifics of what looks to people? Because sometimes saying the word standard, it comes across vague. It's something for listeners and viewers to be able to visualize and imagine of what kind of standards you.
So in terms of a press release, that it's structured in the right ways. So I like to structure a press release like it's a news story, so it can be used straight away, so that the structure is correct and the writing style is in the right way, that it's not misleading. Once I basically asked to put something in a press release that wasn't true. And I refuse to do it because I wouldn't do that. And when you say no, someone who sees themselves as superior, they don't like it. But what they were asking was downright unethical. So I wasn't going to do it, and that was problematic. And things like just not including basic facts in a press release, and also not going through the right processes. Things to do with certain stakeholders were mentioned in a press release, and no one had bothered to contact them and ask if they were okay with it, which is bad form. So stand like that, and I will say quite clearly, things need to be done in the right way. And some people don't like that.
Without overstating it, did you think when with Nation.Cymru felt below standards of the quality of journalism?
It wasn't an issue there because the people I worked with at Nation.Cymru were very good, and the people who I worked with, we were largely in tune with what we were trying to do, what we were trying to achieve. Yeah, that wasn't an issue at all in that workplace.
Was it more or less the people who were coming to you with the stories who you kind of were involved?
I'm talking more about. I'm not talking about journalism here. So I'm talking
Oh, right,
about
yeah.
communications. I'm talking people within an organisation I was working for. That was more in a communications role, and I believe that things need to be done in a certain way. That needs to be done in the right way. And when you work with people who are resolutely determined not to understand that, then it's an issue.
To get you on the podcast is on and talk a bit about your experience with journalism, plus also like how you're able to use that to reflect on news and how you would analyse what you've been seeing recently in terms of the recent general election and states politics. As we discussed about bits about Nation.Cymru, what in terms of what we've seen with the general election and recent representation of politics in Welsh media, what do you think of the quality of the Welsh media and the Welsh publications in reporting on Welsh politics or Westminster politics that is related to the Welsh people and issues relating to Wales?
I think it's very important to have a strong Welsh media. And one reason why Nation.Cymru was created was when compared to somewhere like Scotland, we didn't have as strong a media presence. Nation.Cymru was created to give Wales that strong Welsh perspective, that strong Welsh voice. And that's why I was very proud to become the editor and the work that I did there. And Nation.Cymru is still doing a very important job. And they're breaking some really big, important stories that are agenda setting. And there are a lot of fantastic journalists in Wales. The difficulty is that the media in general has, the internet age, taken a bit of a pasting. Revenues down substantially, print is declining, and although the interest in news hasn't waned, it's a lot more difficult to make money with online, which means it isn't possible to employ as many journalists as it was in the past. So that is a problem. So you've got a lot of journalists out there in Wales working very hard and who don't have as much resources as they did in the past. I think it's very important that we do as much as we can to build the Welsh media, to support the Welsh media, and to strengthen the Welsh media, because on a UK-wide level, you don't see much about Wales. So if we want the Welsh perspective to be reflected, and if we want to know what's going on in our politics, we need a strong Welsh media.
Yeah.
It's vitally important.
Yeah, because especially when, as you mentioned, with the Scottish media, you've got a lot more diversity than you have with Welsh media, because we've got different variations of other Scottish got their own edition of the Times, the Sun, and Mail, etc. So we definitely got more of a diversity of variations of the national newspaper brands specialised for Scotland doing their own editions, and it's like you got a lot more journalists that in the UK media on different national brands, but you got a lot more of those Scottish reporters, positions, and other media organisations that you don't have in Wales. So you do see, even though, as I said, there's a lot of journalists in Wales, but you see a lot lack of employment opportunities, especially when a couple of years ago we had a newspaper banned that long in a year. They end up having to go bust because they didn't have sustainability in finances. So there are definitely issues about that diversity in local media or national media here in Wales.
Yeah, and I do think that I can't say the word, but yeah, I'll just go for diversity because I'm unable to get out the word that I wanted to say. But yeah, it's important to have that diversity of perspectives and to have that competition. The world that we live in is not monolithic, and we need a media that reflects that. And one thing that Nation.Cymru has been able to do very successfully is to add, it wasn't really adding a new perspective, more that it was giving a voice to perspectives that wasn't being heard through the media up until that point. And and I think Nation.Cymru, a landmark and a model for a lot of places to look at and maybe emulate. So I think Nation.Cymru has made an enormous difference, and I hope it continues to do what it's doing, and that it grows and expands. And just as that, I would like to see the Welsh media expand as a whole. And I do think getting that diversity of opinion out there is very important, because the world we live in is diverse. We live in a diverse country, and we need a media that understands and reflects that. And Nation.Cymru has added something very important to the media landscape that wasn't there prior to its existence.
And when we were talking about diversity, of course, one of the parts things as a journalist, when you either when you do freelance or when you was an editor of Nation.Cymru, you offered some diversity in terms of being an autistic, disabled, neurodivergent journalist. But how do you think, as I said, but also as I said about the job opportunities for autistic people, there's a lot of autistic people in not in employment or full-time unemployment. But as I said, getting into the industry of journalism, since your father was a journalist, it was a lot easier to access for yourself. But for other journalists who who are in the industry, do you know of many other journalists who are autistic and neurodivergent, disabled? And do you think that the journalist newsrooms to any different roles, people could be involved who are disabled in your workplaces? Do you think that diversity and inclusion is there? And what are the things that could make a newsroom or the industry of journalism more accessible?
I think journalism might be more accessible than it was in the past, because so much more of it is online and done remotely now. There are negatives to it going remotely, but there are positives as well. And one positive is that it does make the industry more accessible. On the whole, journalism is one of those industries where people are judged on their actual results. But in a lot of workplaces, people aren't judged on results. They're judged on all sorts of other things, many of which aren't actually related to doing the job well. But the news editor will usually be very happy to employ someone who can find good stories. If you can find good stories, then you can make it as a journalist. And one great example of that is a friend that you and I both have, Nick Fern, who's doing a lot of stuff for different UK nationals. He's doing stuff at the Financial Times, and that's because he's being judged on the work that he's doing, and he's not being misjudged because of autistic traits. But I think one thing I think the internet does is that it does create a lot of opportunities. So if someone wants to become a writer, for example, someone can start writing online very easily, and there's a very low barrier to entry, and someone can start writing on a blog, like a blog site like medium.com, and start making some money relatively quickly. It doesn't mean it's an easy way to make money, and doesn't mean you'll make loads of money that way. But I think, because I'm of the view that workplaces are going to become hospitable, or the majority of workplaces aren't going to become hospitable to autistic people anytime soon. I might be wrong. It's the way I think things are going to be at the moment. And so some important work is happening to try and change that. There was a report by the now former MP, Robert Buckland, into autism in the workplace. Yeah, and he's done work, I think, with Autistica, the autism charity, to try and change things as far as autism in the workplace is concerned, and to get employers to buy into changing the way that they do things. And I think that will have some positive impact, and I certainly hope that it does. But I don't foresee a radical change into kind of short to medium term. If an autistic person is struggling to work through the structures that currently exist, because those structures have too many barriers, the environment too inhospitable, then the only option then is to try and create things from outside of those structures, and to do things for ourselves and to become self-sufficient. And I think, for what I understand, quite a lot of autistic people, a lot of neurodiverse people work freelance because they get the autonomy that they need and are judged more on their abilities rather than a misinterpretation of their autistic traits. So there's that, and I think we need to think imaginatively about the opportunities that the internet does make possible, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily easy to realize those opportunities and to bring them to fruition, but it may be the best option for a lot of autistic people, especially if they're struggling to work the structures that
when was saying that, you don't envisage any major change or much change at all in the near future. But if you could actually had the power to make changes, what are some of the things that you would recommend employers to make more inclusive, or what were generally the changes that you would like to see happen?
From my own personal perspective, a lot of it is just a focus on actually really matters for making an organisation work well, and for actually being productive. Within a lot of organisations, there's a lot of buzz and activity, and people are doing this and they're doing that and they're doing the other, but they're not actually doing anything meaningful. And so one organisation that I worked for was just obsessed with having meetings, and most of these meetings were pointless, completely unproductive. I remember once I was in a meeting, it was scheduled for an hour, but it actually ran substantially over time. It was about planning the Christmas do, the Christmas meal. They just spent an age debating this Christmas do. Didn't actually come to any decision by the end. And I was just sat there, bored to tears. And I was thinking, I could actually be doing something productive here. I could be trying to find a good story. I could be writing a press release, a case study, talking with journalists. And there I was, prevented from doing that because I was in this extraordinarily tedious and pointless meeting, and they discussed it with like such seriousness. They discussed it with as if it was like a communique for a NATO summit or something like that. It was absolutely ridiculous. So within a lot of organizations, there's a lot of activity goes on that is actually pointless. And my general principle is this. I think there's a misinterpretation about autistic needs, that you need to, I don't actually think you need to do that much to help a lot of autistic people. What you need to do is strip away the superfluous and to get rid of barriers. So to get rid of pointless meetings, to make communication factual and straightforward, to make communications less ambiguous. It's about clarifying things and making them more efficient and getting rid of the superfluous, and to judge people on their ability to do the job. I think a lot of autistic people benefit from job interviews where they set tasks to accomplish that are relevant to
Yeah.
the job.
When you're saying about that, it's you're trying to like mitigate the need for to be working so many hours or in a job by just actually making sure the hours you are working are actually meaningful work hours, and for any stuff like in terms of Christmas to all work meal or whatever, it's be like a 5 minute email or just a small just discussion and kept minimal. I guess for something that if you maybe like it would be better to work reduced hours if that could be done by making sure you're not overworked with pointless extra.
Yeah, I think it may be difficult. I think there may be some research to back this up that it's harder for a lot of autistic people to work within the larger organizations because large
Yeah,
organizations develop large bureaucracies, develop cumbersome bureaucratic processes, and these structures, these processes, very often act as barriers to meaningful productivity very often, but also as barriers to people. I think it's easier to, in some ways, it's easier to get things done and to get what you need within a smaller
yeah, I do
organization
definitely
and less
understand that.
hierarchical
Yeah,
organizations as well. I think very hierarchical organizations very often aren't good to autistic people
yeah,
because a lot of autistic people interpret hierarchy in a very different way. And,
yeah, because I know
aren't
there is
necessarily
definitely that challenge
deferential.
with hierarchy, but also when you were saying that, it's like that thing. But when to go back to the thing of when you said about how it is much easier and flexible for autistic or disabled people to work as freelancers, but obviously there's can be issues with that, as it's not to get like a stable income or like guaranteed work all the time. How do you feel about sometimes, although we're made easier, but what do you think of how sometimes there is some consequences or some negatives that could be rectified a bit better, or making
Well, yeah,
sure it pays a bit better?
there are certainly downsides to working freelance. There are upsides, and it is something that has the potential to be lucrative. It's not always lucrative, but it can be. But it can be famine or feast, and the paychecks can be irregular. And that can be challenging. It can be stressful. With some people, you need to chase them up for them to pay. Some people are better at paying promptly than others. And if you've got bills to pay and you're having to chase someone up who's not paying, that can be very
So would you would like to see a bit more like early protection for those who are freelancers in terms of making sure that there is like consequences for businesses who are late with the payments to the freelancers, and to make sure that people do get paid on time.
Yeah, there was a big gap during the pandemic, if you remember, because you had the furlough, didn't you? And so
Yes.
if you're in a job, regular employment, you were able to get 80% of your income from
Yeah.
the government.
Oh,
But that wasn't possible for freelance. And that was a major gap, and a lot of
yeah.
freelance people struggled as a
But
result. And there are gaps in the system, and I don't really have all the answers, but
is it something that you would like to see changing a law to make sure people who are freelance are protected in terms of the pay that they are owed?
yeah, certainly. If you do a job,
Yeah.
and you should get paid for it, and there should be enforcement, and there are certain enforcement mechanisms. There's a small claims court, and so on and so forth. But if there is a way to strengthen that, and I don't know what the way would be, but if there is a way to strengthen that, then I would like to see that happen. Now, in terms of what autistic people who are freelancing can do for themselves, what I would recommend is being careful with your clients. Try if you can, and sometimes you have less options and it's more difficult. But try and find clients who are good to work for and who pay properly. That's something you can do. But also try not to be reliant too much on one client and try and get different streams of income. So if one stream gets blocked, you're not completely screwed because you have other money coming in. So what I would, if the government isn't going to be our safety net, we have to try and create safety nets for ourselves.
I think that like certain journalists and communicative unions are providing a good safety net or accessible for independent freelance journalists to be like a safety net or some sort of place to go for seeking advice and support. As we said, like about certain employment rights, making sure your pay is on time. Do you think that those certain trade unions within journalism are working enough, or people are involved enough to actually?
There is a strong journalistic union in Wales. There's a strong Welsh presence in the National Union of Journalists. I think that's the name of the organisation, and they work diligently, advocate strongly for their members across the board. But it is, journalism is a hard industry. It's always been a hard industry, but I think at the moment it's harder than ever. And it can be especially difficult for freelance journalists. Freelance journalism isn't an easy gig. It's a tough gig. It's not easy at all. And that's why I think our friend Nick is doing extraordinarily well, because he's really succeeding. And he shows that it is possible to succeed, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
From how you've been able to have the experience of health issues within your previous journalism, and have you been able to reflect on the result of the general election? What does that mean for neurodivergent, autistic people or and the disabled community?
The general election was very interesting. And it does, like, we're in a new age now that the Conservatives are out of office for the first time in 14 years on a Westminster level. And Labour won quite a handsome majority, 170 seats. But they didn't win a large share of the vote. There are certain strategic reasons for that they gained the system extraordinarily effectively. But it does also possibly point to an underlying weakness in this port, especially in Wales. And the Reform Party came second in a lot of areas in Wales. Plaid Cymru had quite a successful election and gained a couple of seats. And looking to the Senate election, that looks very interesting and to play for. But in terms of neurodiversity or disability or anything of that sort, there wasn't really much talk of that during the elections. But one thing I would say, because public services aren't in a good state at the moment, they're not in a good state in the UK and not in Wales. And when public services, most people suffer, but the people who suffer the most are the most vulnerable and those at the margins of society. You can include a large chunk of autistic people in that. So I think improving public services will hopefully, if that happens, have a positive effect on autistic people. But there's a huge job work to be done there, and the public finances aren't in a particularly healthy state. So where they're going to find this money to invest in the services, and there's no obvious source that I can see. And I'm sure that there are certain kind of reforms that can be made without money and ways to run things better, but there does need to be investments. Well,
I know what you mean, because it does take a time for when the economy and for the economic growth return to the public purse. As you say, if you want to do so many different forms of fund different things within public services or wherever the state can pay for. Can't really do that without increasing taxes or borrowing. So I know you mean the government are with a hard place where they are unable to know what they will be able to spend and how they would be able to fund the promises.
Yeah, the thing is are already very high. I think that they're something like the highest level since the 1930s or something like that. They are very high anyway, and historically high. And economic growth, for the most part, has been anemic to non-existent. So you have this combination of high taxes and low growth, which means there's a dwindling pot for public services. And that is a problem. Well, one thing that, and the incoming Labour government has ruled out a slew of possible tax rises like VAT and so on. That doesn't leave them with a lot of options. Now, they may find other taxes to raise the margins, and I'm sure they probably will do that. But the key to improving things is economic growth. And there's a huge job of work to be done in that area. But in the end, if we are going to get the sustainable, improving public services that we all need, and especially neurodiverse people, then the economy does need to start growing. Yeah, it's as simple as that, really. I'm saying something really obvious there.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a genius to figure it out, but growing the economy is absolutely vital, because otherwise, everything you do and try and improve things will just be at the margins.
You know, as somebody who's trained journalist, being an editor of Nation.Cymru even, what are the things that if you were still editing something within this lesson, or if you were writing a commissioned for any freelance news sites, what would be one of the stories or issues you would be looking to report on that hasn't really been reported on in this general election? What are the things that you'd like to have seen focused on and given time for accountability, question, and scrutiny?
I don't know, really. I don't know. In general, across the board and in media across the world, I would like to see more done on neurodiversity. But very often, journalists go after, they report what political parties are doing. And the fact is that political parties haven't really been focusing on neurodiversity. They've been focusing more on the kind of bread and butter issues, if you like. And you can understand that because they're trying to appeal to a broad electorate. So you can understand why that would happen during election cycle. But the election has been now, and so now it's time to get to the nitty-gritty of these deep-seated, difficult policy issues. And there are things that politicians can do to improve things for neurodiverse people. One thing, Matt Hancock, he's had quite an interesting career and left office as a member of the Conservative cabinet under interesting circumstances. But and he has stood down as an MP. But one important thing he did do before he stood down as an MP was and I think this was as a private member's bill, was a kind of neurodiversity in education. The purpose of this bill was to get it into law that all teachers, that they need to train, that as part of their training, that there needs to be a kind of neurodiverse element. So they understand neurodiversity, they understand the signs of someone being neurodivergent, so they're better able to support neurodivergent kids in the classroom. And this was for England because education is devolved in Wales. But there have been attempts to have something similar in Wales as well, which never came to fruition. So what I would like to see is for politicians to pick up these issues and to push to turn them into law. And if that does happen, then coverage will follow, because at the end of the day, the reporters, they reflect what's going on in politics. And if the politicians themselves aren't doing much to help neurodivergent people, then they're right about it.
Because within a general election, I know there wasn't as much of, apart from the televised debates or any the question and answer sessions of the audience, and other years there has been a lot more the camp politicians actually going out to the public or off, whether it's off camera or off the studio camera debate settings. There's been like less that speaking to members of the public and answering those questions, where something like this may have popped up, but it seemed as an observer this election there was like a lot of focus on that. A lot of the polls, and as I said earlier on about you had the return of the Reform Party, so there was a lot of political stories, even with and DT and stuff like that. There was a lot of the political stories without looking at the issues, and I think there's a lot of stuff that people like watching it, like myself, have seen things that might have gone unnoticed.
Yes, when the D-Day gaffe was made, it was inevitable that the media would cover that and get a lot of coverage. And because what the Prime Minister does is newsworthy, and it's especially newsworthy when it's a big error of judgment, and that clearly was. The Prime Minister does or doesn't do will dictate the media agenda to a certain extent, and the business around betting and so on. Once that broke, it was inevitable that would get an awful lot of coverage. Yeah, once these things came to light, it was inevitable that they would get a lot of attention. And if attention is directed towards one thing, it means there are other things where direction isn't being directed. But we're out of the general election now. It's been, and yeah, hopefully that there'll be less about gaffes and scandals and more about solving knotty policy issues that actually improve people's lives, and certainly neurodivergent people's lives.
In terms of the work you do in terms of freelance writing, and as you say, a lot of the things you do about changing people's, I think on to the last question, or two questions, what are the things that you would like to see changed in people's perception, and even when looking more towards the future of the next 5 years of governance, what are things that I would like to see actually change to happen, or would you like to reflect on in terms of that, then you get commissioned to do it?
Yeah, I would like to see is a much more new understanding of autism, because the autism is, for the large part, pathology, and it's very much seen as a defect. And I don't see it in that way. I see that it's a neurotype that has strengths and weaknesses, and it's a spectrum condition, and therefore, and so there's a great variance to the degrees so that's the case. Yeah. So we need a much more nuanced understanding, but alongside that, we need to remember that there are autistic people who struggle a lot more than, say, I do and some other autistic people do, and we need to be aware of that. Although I'm very eager to challenge this kind of pathologized view of autism, I do think we also need to be careful that by challenging that we don't minimize the real struggles that a lot of other autistic people do have, those who do have much higher
Yeah.
support needs. And
And
so
yeah.
we need to have a much more view, and it's for
And
that
yeah,
nuanced
it's
view that
tricky.
I try and
Yeah,
have.
to the things that you open with the journalism you get commissioned to and the writing you do. What are the things that you would like to focus on in the next coming years or year?
Well, one thing I want to focus on is because there's a lot of scientific research into autism that's going on, and this is a good thing because we do need to understand autism a lot better, and there needs to be a much better understanding of how to make the world a much more hospitable place for autistic people. And this scientific research, a lot of it is incredibly interesting, but I also find myself reading a lot of this scientific research and getting quite annoyed because of the way that it
And
portrays autism without this new. And so I want research to continue. I want the emphasis,
and
the way that it's framed,
yeah, because
to
and like I'm
shift.
just trying. Is there anything else that you haven't got a chance to say that you haven't said already?
I have a bi-monthly column in Able magazine, which is a disability magazine. I would urge people to look at that if they're interested.
And what's like your social media where you can
And I also write a lot about all the people can find me on Twitter.